Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Path of the Prophets. Tonight, we're in the giant city of Cairo on the banks of the Nile River, the longest or second longest river in the world and one of the most important rivers. So when we think about the Nile, it's very biblical. It shows up in the Bible, in the biblical text, multiple times. And we see in the book of Genesis, when it speaks about the Garden of Eden, it says that there are 4 rivers threading through it. And many of the ancient commentators, they tried to find an approximation within our world for these four rivers, insinuating that the garden is actually not separate from our world, but is blocked from our view, that it's veiled from us. And perhaps that's based on the reading of the angel or angels with flaming swords, with a flaming sword, and that the flaming sword is a veil that blocks us from re-entering the garden state, this spiritual state of paradise, from which we came in our original state as humanity. And then our ancestors were banished from the garden and sent into exile. And then we went into the dunya as we know it, where we had to labor and suffer and struggle and give birth and raise children and sow crops. And this was a whole process we had to go through. So this is interesting to think with about the garden and re-entering the garden. Basically, I'm leaning, like what I've been seeing lately is that it has to do with the harvest that Isa alayhi salam speaks of, and I'm going to do some videos on this soon, inshallah, and go into detail, point by point, breaking it down, because it's related to the maturation of humanity, the spiritual evolution of humanity, and where there will be a harvest, and there'll be 2 harvests. Humanity, we are moving into 2 directions. One group is evolving, the other is devolving. One group is moving into devilry and hellfire. The other is moving back to the garden. So the garden, it's interesting when we think about rivers. The ancient commentators of the book of Genesis, they tried to figure out what were these 4 rivers mentioned? What do they equate to? And almost always you hear the Tigris and the Euphrates. And then many of the commentators suggested the Nile River. So this river would have been in the garden, according to them, as was the Tigris and Euphrates. So some aspect of them, maybe a spiritual reality of them. And then the 4th river was sometimes considered to be either the Indus River or perhaps the Ganga Yamuna. Now that one I might be misreading into it, but I definitely read the Indus was thought to have been one of the rivers. I've now been to the Ganga Yamuna, I've been to the Indus, and these are amazing river systems. Now, it's interesting that in some of the Indian traditions, there's a conceptualization that all fresh water is the Ganga. And if we think about it Quranically, we have 2 seas. And many of the commentators have said we have the freshwater sea and we have the saltwater sea. So we've got 2 main bodies of water, a saline body and a fresh body of water. And even in our bodies, our physical body, we are predominantly saline fluid. Our sacred water is salt water, and when we are in the womb, we are in salt water. Now within that salt water is a freshwater stream hidden within it. Somehow meeting with the saline sea, but separated from it by an invisible barrier. This is very interesting. So this is within our body, within the womb, and within the world around us. Now we could say that the freshwater river is not just here behind me, the Nile, but all around me in the air, H2O. You know, like, so it's like we're breathing in water vapor right this very moment, that contains oxygen within it. So we're in a sea of oxygen and a sea of water vapor simultaneously. You know, the atmosphere is a place where 2 seas are meeting. And I would encourage you to think about the 2 seas meeting as a conceptual tool to think about all different aspects of the world. And where things come together, it's a confluence. Confluences are sacred. And so now in the Indian tradition, they speak of the sacredness of confluences. And this is all throughout the Indo-European traditions as well. Our Indo-European ancestors often look at confluences as sacred places for bathing, for spiritual renewal, for purification. And rivers are places automatically of cleansing, not just of hydration, but of cleaning the body. We do full body ghusl in water. Traditionally, we would do them in rivers. Baptism within the pre-Christian and Christian traditions, there was a baptism of full body ghusl that was done. So we could think of all rivers, all fresh water from some Indian perspectives might be the Ganga River, or maybe earlier the Indus or the Sarasvati. And then there could have been a tradition, I would not doubt it if I hear a tradition from the ancient Egyptians saying that all fresh water is the Nile. This is interesting. I'm extending a logic from India into this context. And we're thinking about the garden again, that all the 4 rivers through paradise are still all the same fresh water. There's the one freshwater river. All right, so all rivers could be the Nile. All rivers could be the Tigris or the Euphrates. So now let's go a little bit deeper. I'm going to do a video soon about the gold under the Euphrates River. So I might as well dive a little bit into that now. I was thinking about the Euphrates and this hadith, because the Euphrates River is connected to the Garden of Eden, and it's also connected to the earliest human civilizations at Sumer, then later the Babylonians, the Persians, the Hittites. Various civilizations were associated with this river. Then later we get the Hellenistic Greeks after the Persians. We get the Romans, the Byzantines, and then the various caliphates, the Rashidun Caliphate, the Umayyads, the Abbasids, various caliphates connected to the Euphrates River. And so we get a river that's connected to the Nile does the exact same thing, as does the Indus, as does the Tigris. They connect to the Garden of Eden. They also connect to our primordial state, our early immature human state where we were still in harmony with nature. Then we are brought out of harmony with nature so that we could go through a Toba and Tazkiyah process to come into our maturity and develop our intellects, develop holistically, develop our intellects and our intuition. And so we go through this process, and you see the Tigris and Euphrates and Indus and Nile, they're connected to the garden. They're also connected to the early human civilizations, and then the full process up to the current day. So Cairo is the 6th largest city in the world, and it's got all kinds of high technology associated. I mean, like, it's a 5G city. They've got all kinds of vehicles all around us. You can hear the traffic. The same thing with the Tigris, the Euphrates, and the Indus, and the Ganga, Yamuna. So you got high tech, so you got our early origins, the full development of humanity, then the high tech era that we're in currently, that many of us consider to be the age of the apocalypse. This is the apocalyptic era. These are the end times, the days of Noah. So we want to consider what the Euphrates means, because the drying of the Euphrates is also the drying of the Nile, it's the drying of the Indus, it's the drying of the Ganga, Yamuna. All these, they're all the same river and all have the same story. From our origins as humanity in a garden state when we were in harmony with nature, every step of civilization to the point when we make the conscious choice of spiritually evolving and coming into spiritual maturity, where we go back into the garden, but this time with our full awareness of our interconnection with all things, because Allah has an interconnected, interdependent creation that we're part of, and we're a very special creation. We can actually actively recognize it, and we can communicate and connect with all things. This is a very interesting thing. So the Euphrates, the drying of the Euphrates, connected biblically. When it dries, there are several shayateen or watchers or fallen angels. It just depends on the translations and the conceptualizations. But there are several that have been locked in prison underneath the Euphrates River. And this is very interesting. Also, there's a tremendous treasure of gold that's buried under the Euphrates, and that when it becomes exposed, the whole world will fight for it. 99% of the world will die fighting for it, is one of the stories. And I'll go into more detail in the future, but I wanted to touch on it so that we could think about this as the Nile, the Euphrates, the Indus. They're all the same. You might be like, oh brother, that's too much symbolism. Is it? I'm being very literal. This is an extended literalism. I'm expanding the literal outward as far as freshwater seas that begin from glaciers, from rains, from atmospheric downpourings, and from the fountains within the earth that rise up to the surface and then flow toward a sea going downstream. This is also our path as humans from the garden through civilizational development through the end times and back into the garden. So what happens when the river dries? What's that mean? The mercy is depleted, because water and mercy are often, read biblically and Quranically as being intertwined and tied together. So we need to consider that the drying of the Euphrates, the drying of the Nile, we read them holistically. We read them literally with linguistics, with socio-historical context. We want to read them we read them symbolically. We read an inner and an outer aspect to them. We want to understand it from as many angles as possible, sifting the broadest data set possible. So what's buried under here? It's the treasure of humanity. It's our inheritance. Because if it's a prison, if these rivers hold a prison for demonic entities, for shayateen, a'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, it's also the wall from Surah Al-Kahf, because it's a barrier preventing the shayateen from fully escaping and wreaking havoc. Now they're going to have their opportunity to do that as part of prophecy. So I'm thinking about this and trying to consider. I'm showing you a bit of a thinking process, because we need to be thinking deeply about these topics. But there's something hidden for us that's already ours. We don't have to fight for it. We're not supposed to fight for it because it's ours. It's for the orphans. Who are the orphans? We are orphans. Our mother and father, Adam and Hawa alayhi salam, are long gone. We are orphans, all of us. So if you are a child of Adam and Hawa alayhim salam, you are an orphan with a vast inheritance, and it's hidden under a barrier of mercy that has been being depleted by satanic behavior. So we need to ensure that now we always have access to the mercy as children of Adam alayhi salam, but as people seal their hearts and go through ritualistic behavior and leave the righteous path and behave in cold, callous ways to one another, because these are the days when people's love grows cold, it waxes cold. We have access to not only vast mercy, we also have access to a tremendous treasure and inheritance that is yours and mine if we but ready ourselves for it. While those who are not on the path of maturation, not on the path of spiritual evolution, they are experiencing there's less and less mercy for them, and they're fighting over material things as if that was the inheritance. That's not the inheritance. The inheritance is a way of life, a way of flowing in harmony, living in harmony with nature, with one another, with all of Allah's interconnected, interdependent nature and creation, which our heart is the connecting point, the door to all worlds, by Allah's command, by His permission, by His design. But we have not yet attained our true maturity, but we're entering, and it only takes but a few, perhaps only a little over 100,000. You know, people talk about the 12 tribes of Revelation. I think Bani Israel is humanity, all of humanity. It's not just a genetic group. And go back and listen to the Nabi Nuh alayhi salam series for a little bit more detail on how I'm conceptualizing of this topic. But we are all Bani Israel if we but remember. We have been enslaved, and now it's time for freedom and to come into our own as the caliphs of the earth, as the children of Adam alayhi salam. Sovereign, free-ranging, upstanding, rectified humanity, mature, aware, loving, compassionate, merciful, and just. So let's just think about, I'm putting a lot of information out there. You know, like I've been having a bunch of openings and I just want to share. And I pray that you will find some benefit within it, inshallah. But we'll discuss it in more detail soon. Until next time, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.